I remember everything about the day the world changed. Every last detail burned into my memory. The war with the humans had been the longest, most brutal conflict our people had ever known. By the time it ended, our fleets were wrecked, and half of our colonies were gone. But you wouldn't have known any of that from life on our homeworld, Thais. For us, the war always felt distant, happening light years away across the galaxy. We saw trade with the outer colonies drying up. We saw condolence messages delivered to the families of fallen soldiers. But that was war. That's how it had always been. We were a martial people, hardened by conflict. And we had always defended what was ours, across every star system we touched. The war never came to Tyrax itself, not once. So we just kept living our lives, confident, even complacent, thinking the battlefront would always stay somewhere beyond the stars. Sure, the cargo ships stopped showing up, and sure, more and more families were wearing mourning ribbons, but that was normal during wartime. Hard times brought out the best in us. That was what we believed. When things got dark, we lit the fire brighter. If we were hit, we struck back twice as hard. And when we won, and we always did, we savored that victory all the more. We never surrendered, not Tyrians, never. So when the government told us we were going to surrender to the humans, the shock was unimaginable. At first, nobody believed it. It had to be a mistake. Maybe a miscommunication, some worst-case scenario accidentally broadcast on the public channel. Maybe a misprint. Or sabotage. Maybe it was actually the humans surrendering, and someone had mixed up the feed. But as the hours passed, more and more confirmations rolled in. The message was repeated by news anchors, military briefings, emergency broadcasts. There was no mistake, no glitch. This was real. The war was over, and we'd lost. The surrender was official. The entire planet froze. No one went to work. Schools closed. Streets filled with dazed citizens wandering aimlessly, unable to process what they were hearing. It didn't make sense. We had the best military in the galaxy. And hadn't the war started in our favor? We destroyed an entire human fleet in our opening strike. We took over several of their outer colonies before they even had time to respond. We held every strategic card. But it wasn't just about tactics. The humans were our sworn enemies. They had armed. There were a few protests, angry voices shouting that we should keep fighting, no matter the cost. Some were soldiers, some were civilians, but none of the protests lasted long. The government had anticipated unrest. Loyalist troops were already stationed at major locations across the planet. The most intense protests were crushed quickly. The smaller ones just fizzled out when no one else joined in. Most of us? We just sat in silence and waited for the humans to arrive. About a month after the announcement, they finally did. The government didn't tell us much, probably trying to avoid a full-scale panic. But one night, they broadcast a simple message. The human fleet would arrive in orbit the following day. That was it. No panic. Just silence. People said goodbye to their families. Some locked themselves in their homes, waiting for the sound of boots on the stairs. Others gathered quietly on rooftops or in public squares, just watching the skies. And then they came. I watched through my telescope as the ships arrived, rows upon rows of them, each sleek and massive, hanging in orbit above Thais. Their ships weren't much larger than ours, but there were so many of them. I counted more than twice the number our largest fleet had launched at the beginning of the war. And that wasn't even their full force. We'd heard reports that other human fleets were still out there. occupying our captured colonies, hunting down our remaining military units, seeing that armada above our world. That was the moment I truly understood. We hadn't been tricked. We hadn't been betrayed. We'd just been outmatched, completely and utterly. The surrender ceremony was held in the fighter bay of the human flagship. Every screen on the planet broadcast it live. We expected humiliation. Our leaders marched in chains, forced to kneel before human commanders, forced to beg forgiveness, to swear loyalty to the invaders, maybe even executed on camera. That's what we would have done. Instead, the humans handed our leaders a pen. They asked them to sign a document. The soldiers moved through the streets like a force of nature, precise, coordinated, unstoppable. Their boots thudded rhythmically against the pavement, their armor gleaming under the city lights. It was mesmerizing in a strange way, almost hypnotic. I wasn't the only one watching. I saw neighbors at their windows too, peering out in awe and fear, silent and wide-eyed. That was the first time it really hit me. We had no idea what we'd been fighting against. We'd thought the humans were just another upstart race, meddling where they didn't belong. We thought we had them figured out, arrogant, aggressive, impulsive. But standing there, watching those ranks of armored giants move like clockwork, I felt something else entirely. Respect and dread. Maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't have started this war. I was still frozen at the window when something happened. Something I'll never forget. From the corner of my vision, I noticed movement on the opposite side of the street. A little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old, had wandered out from the building across from mine. Just a tiny figure in a fluttering white dress, completely unaware of the danger. She was walking straight into the path of the armored column. I remember the way the sunlight caught her dress, the way she paused to look up at the massive soldiers towering over her. My heart stopped. I expected gunfire, or for her to be crushed beneath those heavy metallic boots. I couldn't even move, just watched in horror. But that's not what happened. One of the human soldiers, without breaking formation, stepped forward, knelt down, and scooped her up, gently, as if she were made of glass. The girl didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. He carried her back to the building, set her carefully down on a bench, then pulled something from a pouch on his armor. I couldn't see what it was. His back was to me, but a moment later, he gave it to her and jogged back into formation like nothing had happened. A few seconds later, the girl unwrapped the small packet. It was food. The human had given her food. Someone rushed out and pulled the girl back into the building, but the soldiers just kept marching. No drama, no violence, no attempt to draw attention to the act. That one moment, simple as it was, shook me to my core. Everything I had expected from this invasion was wrong. The executions that never came. The kindness from a so-called enemy. The cold, brutal occupation we had feared hadn't arrived. Not yet. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think, maybe, just maybe, we'd been wrong about the humans. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, watching the skies, the checkpoints, the patrols. I kept thinking about that soldier, about how he had handled that child like she was something precious. It didn't make sense, not with everything we'd been told. Had we really been lied to? Or had we just seen what we wanted to see? Maybe the stories of mass executions and forced labor camps were exaggerated or made up entirely. Maybe the chaos in the outer colonies was something else entirely, twisted through panic and rumor before it ever reached us. By the next morning, I had decided to find out for myself. I still had a job, technically. A low-level government clerk, nothing important, just managing payroll and records. But my department had been absorbed by the occupation forces, and I was expected to report in. I wasn't sure if my heart was hammering as I walked the hall. We passed several human soldiers in lighter armor, less imposing than the heavy infantry, but still intimidating. Every one of us in that hallway was thinking the same thing. Is this it? When we got to the room, we sat in silence, 24 of us waiting. After a few minutes, a human walked in. No armor, no weapons, just a plain uniform and a data tablet in his hand. He introduced himself as Doug. At first, we weren't sure if that was his name or a title. It didn't sound like anything in our language, and it took me weeks to learn how to pronounce it right. Doug didn't give a speech. He didn't bark orders. He just started talking. Calm, methodical, direct. He explained that he'd be overseeing clerical departments in our city and that there would be a few changes. Formatting updates, new filing procedures, a reorganization of reporting structures. We'd be expected to file political documents in triplicate, one copy for local records, one for the planetary government, and one for review by the censors. But for now, he said, staffing levels would remain unchanged. He didn't threaten us, didn't talk about purges or punishments. In fact, he said he hoped we'd work together to rebuild Tyrax into a stronger society. And then the meeting ended. That was it. We returned to our desks in a daze. The terror hadn't come. The firing squads hadn't materialized. There were no slave camps. Just regular work, accounting, paperwork, normalcy. Over the weeks that followed, I got to know Doug better. He was polite, often surprisingly kind, and very good at his job. Occasionally random in that alien way, but he treated me with more respect than my Tyrian supervisors ever had. And I wasn't the only one. A few of my colleagues even started joking with the human staff. Little things at first, but it grew. Friendship, even. It was strange, surreal. The war had taken millions of lives. Entire cities had been destroyed. Weeks turned into months, and the strangest part? Life didn't just continue. It started to feel stable again. Sure, the human soldiers were still there. Checkpoints dotted the cities. Surveillance drones floated silently overhead. But we weren't being hunted. We weren't being punished. We were adapting. The occupation wasn't what we had feared. It wasn't a boot stamping on our necks forever. It was more like an audit. A comprehensive alien-run audit of our systems, our institutions, our entire way of life. And while that idea was uncomfortable, it wasn't unbearable. There were arrests, yes, but only for those who'd committed actual crimes during the war. Those who had overseen prisoner massacres, or deployed banned weapons, or tortured captives. And when those people were brought to trial, the evidence was aired publicly. There was no hiding it, no ambiguity. Even we, who had once called those men heroes, couldn't deny the truth when it was laid bare. And there were no mass executions, no forced labor, no purge of our population, just order. Cold, quiet, methodical order. I kept working in my department, still doing payroll, still managing budgets. Only now the budgets were for rebuilding infrastructure under human oversight. We repaired power grids. We reconnected water networks. Public transport started running again. I got used to seeing humans walking alongside Tyrians in the streets. The sight of their towering armored soldiers no longer made me flinch. I learned the names of a few of the human administrators. And Doug? Doug became a regular part of my day. We met often. He was a little awkward, sometimes made strange jokes I didn't quite get. But I could tell he genuinely cared about his work. And surprisingly, about us. He once brought in something he called coffee from his homeworld. Bitter, dark, utterly unlike anything we had. But after a while, I found myself craving it in the mornings. It became a small ritual. He'd offer me a cup. I'd accept, and we'd sit together, watching over the day's reports. It was during one of those quiet mornings that I realized what had. One of them, a logistics officer named Kara, invited me to an art exhibit she helped organize. It featured human and Tyrian artists side by side. For the first time in my life, I saw a human painting with my own eyes. It moved me more than I can explain. It made me think about all the things we'd never known, never bothered to learn about their species before going to war. All the wonders we might have shared, if we hadn't been so obsessed with seeing them as threats. We'd fought them because we thought they were monsters. But monsters don't hold art shows. They don't rescue children. They don't share coffee. Eventually, I stopped referring to them as the humans in my head. I started thinking of them by their names. Doug, Kara, Nilesh, Amira. Officers, yes. Occupiers, yes. But also colleagues, neighbors, in some cases, friends. There was one more shift I didn't see coming. One day, I found myself on a committee, half Tyrian, half human, tasked with restructuring our civic record system. It was dry, tedious work, but essential. And during a break, someone asked what we should call the new joint department. People threw out names, some funny, some serious, and then I heard myself say, "Why don't we just call it the Civic Trust?" Everyone paused, then Doug nodded. Simple, functional, I like it. They put it to a vote. It passed unanimously. That name, Civic Trust, ended up on a building sign a few weeks later. I walked past it on my way to work, and I felt a strange sort of pride. As if, in some tiny way, I had helped build something new. That was the moment I knew. The war really was over. Not just the shooting. Not just the surrender. The war inside us, the one that kept trying to hold on to the past, to bitterness, to pride. It was ending too. And something else was beginning. We still remembered what we'd lost. We honored our dead. We studied the war so we'd never repeat it. But we no longer lived in its shadow. We moved forward. And I came to believe something I never would have dreamed on the day the surrender was announced. The arrival of the humans wasn't the end of the world. It was the end of an era, the end of the old ties. But in its place, a new ties was rising. One where we worked with others instead of against them. One where we valued understanding over dominance. One where we learned to listen, to question, to grow. I don't know what the future holds. There are still tensions, still misunderstandings, still wounds left to heal. But we are healing. And we are building something better. Together. If you'd told me, back on that first day, that I'd ever think of the humans as allies, as partners, as friends, I would have laughed in your face. But here I am. And I wouldn't trade this new world for anything. Not even the old one.